Hello everyone. This video is going to be a bit longer than the normal ones that I put out because it's covering the history of the gay rights movements and how we got to where we are today. So, the gay rights movement in the United States has seen huge progress in the last century and especially in the last 2 decades. Laws prohibiting homosexual activity have been struck down. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals can now serve openly in the military, or at least somewhat openly, and at least for now. Same sex couples can now legally get married and adopt children in all 50 states. But it has been a long and bumpy road for gay rights proponents who are still advocating for employment, housing, and transgender rights. In 1924, Henry Gerber, a German immigrant, founded in Chicago the Society for Human Rights, the first documented gay rights organization in the United States. During his U.S. Army service in World War I, Gerber was inspired to create his organization by the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, a homosexual emancipation group in Germany. Gerber's small group published a few issues of its newsletter, Friendship and Freedom, the country's first gay interest newsletter. Police raids caused the groups to disband in 1925, but 90 years later, the U.S. government designated Gerber's Chicago house a National Historic Landmark. The gay rights movement stagnated for the next few decades, though LGBT individuals around the world did come into the spotlight a few times. For example, English poet and author Radcliffe Hall stirred up controversy in 1928 when she published her lesbian themed novel, The Well of Loneliness. During World War II, the Nazis let, held homosexual men in concentration camps, branding them with the infamous pink triangle badge, which was also given to sexual predators. Additionally, in 1948, in his book Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, Alfred Kinsey proposed that male sexual orientation lies on a continuum between exclusively homosexual to exclusively heterosexual. In 1950, Harry Hay founded the Mattachine Foundation, one of the nation's first gay rights groups. The Los Angeles organization coined the term homophile, which was considered less clinical and focused on sexual activity than homosexual. Though it started off small, the foundation, which sought to improve the lives of gay men through discussion groups and related activities, expanded after founding member Dell Jennings was arrested in 1952 for solicitation and then later set free due to a deadlocked jury. At the end of the year, Jennings formed another organization called One Incorporated, which welcomed women and published One, the country's first pro gay magazine. Jennings was ousted from One Incorporated in 1953 in part for being a communist. He and Harry Hay were also kicked out of the Mattachine Foundation for their communism, but the magazine continued. In 1958, One Incorporated won a lawsuit against the U.S. Post Office, which in 1954 declared the magazine obscene and refused to deliver it. Mattachine Foundation members restructured the organization to form the Mattachine Society, which had local chapters in other parts of the country and in 1955 began publishing the country's second gay publication, the Mattachine Review. That same year, four lesbian couples in San Francisco founded an organization called the Daughters of Bilitis, which soon began publishing a newsletter called The Ladder, the first lesbian publication of any kind. These early years of the movement also faced some notable setbacks. The American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a form of mental disorder in 1952. The following year, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed an executive order that banned gay people, or more specifically, people guilty of sexual perversion, from federal jobs. This ban would remain in effect for some 20 years. The gay rights movement saw some early progress in the 1960s. In 1961, Illinois became the first state to do away with its anti sodomy laws, effectively decriminalizing homosexuality, and a local TV station in California aired the first documentary about homosexuality called The Rejected. In 1965, Dr. John Olivan, in his book Sexual Hygiene and Pathology, coined the term transgender to describe someone who was born in the body of the incorrect sex. But more than 10 years earlier, transgender individuals entered the American consciousness when Christine Jorgensen came out as a trans woman following gender confirmation surgery. Despite this progress, LGBTQ individuals lived in a kind of urban subculture and were routinely subjected to harassment and persecution, such as in bars and in restaurants. In fact, gay men and women in New York City could not be served alcohol in public due to liquor laws and considered the gathering of homosexuals to be disorderly. In fear of being shut down by authorities, bartenders would deny drinks to patrons suspected of being gay or kick them out altogether. Others would serve them drinks but force them to sit facing away from other customers to prevent them socializing. In 1966, members of the Medicine Society of New York City staged a sip in, a twist on the sit in protest of the 1960s, in which gay and waited to be turned away so that they could sue. They were denied service at the Greenwich Village Tavern, Julius, resulting in much publicity and the quick reversal of the anti gay liquor laws. A few years later, in 1969, a now famous event catalyzed the gay rights movement, the Stonewall Riots. The clandestine gay club Stonewall Inn was an institution in Greenwich Village because it was large, cheap, allowed dancing, and welcomed drag queens and homeless youth. But in the early hours of June 28, 1969, New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn. Fed up with the years of police harassment, patrons and neighborhood residents began throwing objects at police as they loaded the arrested into the police vans. The scene eventually exploded into a full blown riot with subsequent protests that lasted 5 more days. During this raid, that happened with no warning from the police. While armed with a warrant and weapons, police officers roughed up patrons and arrested people for bootlegged alcohol and other violations, including criminal mischief and disorderly conduct. More and more police arrived, and the crowd erupted after police roughed up a woman dressed in masculine attire who had complained that her handcuffs were too tight. Shortly after the Stonewall Uprising, members of the Medicine Society split off to form the Gay Liberation Front, a radical group that launched public demonstration protests and confrontations with political officials. Similar groups followed, including the Gay Activist Alliance, Radical Lesbians, and Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, aka STAR. In 1970, at the 1 year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, New York City community members marched through local streets in commemoration of the event, named the Christopher Street Liberation Day. The march is now considered the country's first gay pride parade, Activists also turned the once disreputable pink triangle into a symbol of gay pride. The increased visibility and activism of LGBTQ individuals in the 1970s helped the movement make progress on multiple fronts. In 1977, for instance, the New York Supreme Court ruled that transgender woman Renee Richards could play at the United States Open tennis tournament as a woman, as the woman that she is. Additionally, several openly LGBTQ plus individuals secured public office positions. Kathy Kozachenko won a seat to the Ann Arbor, Michigan City Council in 1974, becoming the first out American to be elected to public office. Harvey Milk, who campaigned on the pro gay rights platform, became the San Francisco city supervisor in 1978, becoming the first openly gay man elected to a political office in California. Milk asked Gilbert Baker, an artist and gay rights activist, to create an emblem that represents the movement and would be seen as a symbol of pride. Baker designed and stitched together the first rainbow flag, which he unveiled at the Pride Parade in 1978. The following year, in 1979, more than 100,000 people took part in the first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. The outbreak of AIDS in the United States dominated the struggle for gay rights in the 1980s and early 1990s. In 1981, the CDC published a report about five previously healthy homosexual men becoming infected with the rare type of pneumonia. By 1984, researchers had identified the cause of AIDS, or HIV, and the FDA licensed the first commercial blood test for HIV in 1985. 2 years later, the first antiretroviral medication for HIV, known as AZT, became available. Gay rights proponents held the Second National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights in 1987. The occasion marked the first national coverage of ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, an advocacy group seeking to improve the lives of AIDS victims. The World Health Organization in 1988 declared December 1st to be World AIDS Day. By the end of the decade, there were at least 100,000 reported cases of AIDS in the United States. In 1992, Bill Clinton, during his campaign to become president, promised he would lift the ban against gays in the military. But after failing to garner enough support for such an open policy, President Clinton in 1993 passed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which allowed gay men and women to serve in the military as long as they kept their sexuality a secret. Gay rights advocates decried the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy as it did little to stop people from being discharged on the grounds of their sexuality. In 2011, President Obama fulfilled a campaign promise to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. By that time, more than 12,000 officers had become discharged from the military under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy for refusing to hide their sexuality. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was officially repealed on September 20th, 2011. In 1992, D.C. passed a law that allowed gay and lesbian couples to register as domestic partners, granting them some of the rights of marriage. In 1993, the highest court in Hawaii ruled that a ban on gay marriages may go against the state's constitution. State voters disagreed, however, in 1998 passed a law banning same-sex marriages. Federal lawmakers also disagreed, and Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which Clinton signed into law in 1966. The law prevented the government from granting a federal marriage benefit to same sex marriage benefits to same sex couples and allowed states to refuse to recognize same sex marriage certificates from other states. Though marriage rights backtracked, gay rights advocates scored other victories. In 1994, a new anti hate crime law allowed judges to impose harsher sentences if a crime was motivated by the victim's sexual orientation. In 2003, gay rights proponents had another bit of happy news. The U.S. Supreme Court in Lawrence versus Texas struck down the state's anti sodomy law. The landmark ruling effectively decriminalized homosexual relations nationwide. In 2009, President Obama signed into law a new hate crime act, commonly known as the Matthew Shepard Act. The new law extended the reach of the 1994 hate crime law. The act was a response to a 1998 murder of 21-year-old Matthew Shepard, who was pistol whipped, tortured, and tied to a fence and left to die. The murder was thought to be driven by Shepard's perceived homosexuality. In 2011, President Obama fulfilled a campaign's promise to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. By that time, more than 12,000 officers had been discharged from the military under DADT for refusing to hide their sexuality. A couple of years later, the Supreme Court ruled against Section 3 of DOMA, which allowed the government to deny federal benefits to married same sex couples. DOMA soon became powerless when, in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot ban same sex marriage, making gay marriage legal throughout the country. One day after that landmark 2015 ruling, the Boy Scouts of America lifted their ban against openly gay leaders and employees. In 2017, it reversed a century-old ban against transgender boys, finally catching up with the Girl Scouts of the USA, which had long been inclusive of LGBTQ leaders and children. The organization had accepted its first trans Girl Scout in 2011. In 2016, the U.S. military lifted its ban on transgender people serving openly, a month after Eric Fanning became Secretary of the Army and the first openly gay Secretary of the U.S. military branch. In March 2018, President Donald Trump announced a new transgender policy for the military that again banned most trans people from military service. On Jan 25, 2021, his sixth day in office, President Biden signed an executive order overturning this ban. Though LGBTQ Americans now have same sex marriage rights and numerous other rights that seemed far fetched 100 years ago, the work of advocates is far from over. Universal workplace anti discrimination laws for LGBTQ plus Americans is still lacking. Gay rights proponents must also contend with an increasing number of religious liberty state laws which allow businesses to deny service in LGBTQ individuals due to religious beliefs, as well as bathroom laws that prevent transgender individuals from using public bathrooms that don't correspond to their sex at birth. Additionally, several states have passed legislation targeting trans youth, and in Texas, their parents preventing them from competing in school sponsored athletics that correspond with their gender identity and assessing gender affirming medical care. Massachusetts was the first state to legalize gay marriage, and the first legal same sex marriage was performed on May 17, 2004, a day when 77 other couples across the state also tied the knot. Edith Winslow and Thea Spire wed in Ontario, Canada in 2007. The state of New York recognized the residence marriage, but the federal government did not. When Spire died in 2009, she left her estate to Windsor. Since the couple's marriage was not federally recognized, Windsor didn't qualify for tax exemption as a surviving spouse. Windsor sued the government in late 2010, in the United States versus Winslow. Months later, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder announced the Obama administration would no longer defer DOMA. In 2012, the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that DOMA violates the Constitution Equal Protection Clause, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments for the case. The court ruled in favor of Winslow. Gay marriage was finally ruled legal by the Supreme Court in June 2015 in Obergefell versus Hodges. The plaintiffs, led by Jim Obergefell, who sued because he was unable to put his name on his late husband's death certificate, argued that the laws violated the Equal Protection Clause and Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Conservative Justice Anthony Kennedy sided with Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan in favor of same sex marriage rights, ultimately making gay marriage legal across the nation on June 2015. The ruling read in part: "No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say that they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of the civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right." On December 13, 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Respect for Marriage Act into law. The law requires that individual states recognize same sex and interracial marriages that were lawfully performed in other states. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.